Welcome to Dialogue. Today we are taking a necessary and, let's be honest, a pretty cold-blooded look at the conflict that's dominating global headlines, the war in Ukraine.
Yeah.
But we're going to do something a little different. We're deliberately pulling back from the geopolitical drama. We're stripping away the flags, the ideology, all of that deep emotional context. Our focus today is purely economic. We're going to analyze the mechanics of this conflict, not as a moral struggle, but as what our sources describe as a meticulously structured, highly lucrative proxy war business model.
And that really is the mission for this deep dive. The material we've synthesized suggests that once you actually analyze the funding cycles, you look at who the beneficiaries are, and you map out the structural incentives, a compelling picture starts to emerge. This isn't just a military campaign. It appears to be a highly optimized system. I mean, it's designed to maximize continuation and to secure long-term profit streams for very specific external stakeholders.
Okay, let's unpack this immediately, because the central thesis here is it's provocative. And frankly, it changes the way you look at every single headline. The idea is that this conflict is being run less like a traditional war, aiming for a swift victory, and more like a proxy war with a subscription plan.
A subscription plan. That's a powerful way to put it.
It's been so perfectly framed, so moral, so necessary, so heavily branded in the media, that according to this analysis, the rhetoric around it ensures no one's allowed to ask how long it's supposed to last. So, our job today is to interrogate the financial structure that sustains that level of indefinite commitment.
Right. And to understand the business model, we first have to understand the product structure itself. I mean, what even defines a modern proxy war in this context? Fundamentally, it's about major world powers engaging in these high-stakes strategic conflicts without ever actually, declaring war on each other or fighting directly.
So they get all the strategic benefits, the testing of weapons, the geopolitical pressure, without suffering the primary liabilities.
Precisely. It's a highly efficient way of managing existential risk. You avoid the catastrophic downside of, say, a large-scale military confrontation between nuclear-armed peers while still pursuing your core strategic objectives, weakening an adversary, testing your defenses, cementing alliances.
But the brutal consequence, of course, is that the violence is successfully outsourced. The dying, the tragic price, is borne exclusively by the host country and its people.
It's all localized.
Outsourcing violence. That's a jarring phrase, but it brings a lot of clarity to the economic dynamic. And to illustrate this model, the sources offer a truly memorable analogy. A proxy war in this modern context is like Uber, but for artillery.
That analogy, it really works because it highlights the distribution of cost versus benefits so perfectly. I mean, think about the Uber model for a second. The platform, which is the major external power here, they set the price, they define the route, and they route the vast majority of the financial reward and, crucially, the strategic data. They manage the logistics, the tech interface.
While the driver, in this case, the host country, provides the actual service, the ground engagement, the vehicle, and they take on all the direct risks.
All of it. The wear and tear on their infrastructure, the physical danger, the localized economic disruption. It's all on them.
So the external powers are essentially the venture capitalists of the conflict, while Ukraine is the boots-on-the-ground operator bearing this immense physical and human cost. And if that's the operational analogy, then the host country is serving a very specific function for its backers. A function described as hosting a geopolitical stress test.
A stress test is the perfect term for this. For decades, you have to remember, Western military doctrine and hardware development. It was almost exclusively focused on counterinsurgency, managing terrorism, smaller asymmetrical conflicts. They weren't testing their systems against a massive state-level opponent with advanced electronic warfare, sophisticated missile defense, and just immense artillery stockpiles. This conflict changed all of that overnight.
So this stress test is happening on multiple levels. It's not just about, seeing if a tank survives a direct hit. It's allowing these powers to test their full suite of assets under real combat conditions. Questions like, how resilient are our satellite communications when they're being actively jammed? Can our supply chains handle sustained, high-volume demand under fire? Does our new drone tech integrate seamlessly with 20-year-old ground systems?
Yes, exactly. It's R&D in the most brutal, high-fidelity laboratory you could possibly imagine. The material details they gather are invaluable. They reveal vulnerabilities, system bottlenecks, the true efficacy of their doctrine against a peer competitor in ways that no simulation, no controlled training exercise ever could. And critically, because the source material specifies a stress test, it implies pushing these systems, pushing the logistics chains to their breaking point.
And understanding where those failure points are.
Exactly. Understanding those failure points in Ukraine allows external powers to adjust their procurement or their doctrine globally. It ensures their future defense budgets are spent correcting real battlefield-proven weaknesses.
And the economic implication of this outsourced violence is just so stark when we look at the cost distribution. We've established the immediate price, the lives lost, the infrastructure destroyed, the environment ravaged. That's all localized within the host country.
While the strategic benefits, the invaluable testing data, the practical lessons learned, the clearance of old weapons inventory, and of course the massive corporate profits being generated, all of that accrues primarily to the external powers. It's a complete internalization of the profit and externalization of the true cost. It creates a risk-reward ratio that is just incredibly favorable to those standing outside the immediate conflict zone.
Here is where the analysis really shifts from geopolitical strategy to pure finance. Our sources identify four distinct yet interlocking characteristics that transform this conflict from just a war into what they call an almost flawless business scenario for the global defense industry. It's like discovering a market where demand is not only guaranteed but is structurally engineered to be permanent.
The first two conditions relate to the sheer scale and resource intensity of the fighting, a dynamic we really haven't seen since the end of the Cold War. The first is large-scale conventional warfare. For the defense industry, this is gold. For the last 30 years, conflicts mostly meant fighting insurgents in mountains or deserts. That type of conflict, while obviously very serious, relies on specialized lower volume consumption.
Right, you talk about light armored vehicles, reconnaissance drones, precision-guided munitions used very selectively.
And a big reliance on infantry small arms. But conventional warfare is a completely different animal. We're talking about the attrition and resupply requirements you need when two massive industrialized armies are facing off along hundreds of kilometers of front line.
You're burning through tens of thousands of heavy artillery shells every single day. You need constant replacement of main battle tanks, complex air defense systems, massive volumes of spare parts. It's a consumption machine.
This high-intensity consumption is incredibly rare and exceptionally valuable to manufacturers because it immediately justifies scaling up dormant or reduced capacity production lines to meet a demand that you know will not disappear overnight. It transitions the industry from custom, bespoke orders to mass production, which is a much more profitable model.
Which brings us directly to the second condition: endless resupply needs. Because the conflict is conventional and so destructive, the attrition rate for major platforms is severe and consistent.
Absolutely. A tank that might last 20 years in peacetime training, it might be destroyed in 20 minutes on the front line. This environment demands continuous, rapid replacement of anything that's destroyed, damaged, or captured.
So this is the difference between a one-time surge order and that subscription plan you mentioned earlier.
Exactly. A one-time order is profitable, sure, but a requirement for predictable, recurring replacement that lasts for years. That provides the financial stability you need for long-term industrial investment and revenue projection. Defense contractors can confidently invest billions in new factories, knowing the government is contractually obligated to continuously replace the inventory being consumed overseas.
Then we get to the third condition, which is, I think, where the cynical brilliance of the business model really comes into focus. It's the concept of no clear victory conditions.
This is key. If the external powers, the funding entities, define the war's goal as achieving a specific, measurable metric, like, say, securing a particular border or signing a treaty, the entire funding apparatus risks conclusion. The business would close down.
So instead, the goals remain deliberately undefined. They're amorphous.
Or they're centered on these subjective moral concepts like supporting democracy, restoring sovereignty, or, crucially, bleeding the enemy. When your stated goal is to support an effort rather than to achieve an objective, there is no natural endpoint.
So the undefined goals act as a kind of guarantee.
They're a guarantee. They prevent the business from concluding, and they ensure continuation, not resolution. The structural vagueness is a feature, not a bug, of the funding model.
I have to push back on that a little bit, though. Wouldn't the external powers, particularly the U.S. and NATO nations, have a vested interest in a swift, decisive victory? To stabilize the region, deter future aggression? Or is the claim here that the financial benefits of continuation actually outweigh the strategic benefits of resolution?
The analysis argues for the latter, at least for the duration of the current funding cycles. The material suggests that while a stable peace is, of course, desirable geopolitically for the defense sector and these large institutional security organizations, the indefinite conflict status quo is more financially perfect.
How so?
A swift victory risks immediate budget cuts and questions of relevance. A long-term, stable yet unresolved conflict guarantees stable funding and long-term project viability. The financial incentive is structured to favor duration. We can even look at historical conflicts where, once the initial objectives were met, the mission scope just kept expanding to justify maintaining forces, equipment, and budgets. That tendency is just amplified here.
And that's all protected by the final condition, public moral clarity. This is the political shield for the whole financial mechanism. The narrative, as it's consumed by the public, has to be radically simplified. Pure, unambiguous, good guys versus bad guys.
This simplification is essential for minimizing political risk. When the moral case for funding is presented as absolute, a murder, a fight for freedom against an unprovoked aggressor, questioning the necessity of the spending or the efficiency of the mechanism becomes politically hazardous for any elected official.
It ensures robust, sustained public support. It allows these massive multi-billion-dollar funding packages to be approved with minimal friction.
The moral certainty acts as the necessary lubricant for the financial machine.
It's a powerful funding accelerator. It makes the debate about whether to send aid irrelevant, and it only leaves the question of how much to send. And this whole dynamic, the sources argue, is basically a Cold War sequel with modern hardware.
And, like all sequels, this one came with a significantly increased price tag. The Cold War provided decades of stable, large-scale budgets justified by that massive existential Soviet threat. This conflict has instantly revived that foundational threat structure. But the equipment required today, the sophisticated drone platforms, integrated command systems, long-range precision missiles, they are vastly more complex and exponentially more costly than the tanks and aircraft of the 1980s. The whole system has been rebooted, but at 21st century prices, which conveniently justifies the exponentially higher budgets we're seeing today.
Let's transition now to the core mechanism of that funding, because this is where the economic reality presented in the analysis most dramatically diverges from popular perception. We need to deconstruct the word aid. It sounds so charitable, doesn't it? Altruistic, like a donation. But the sources present a profoundly different economic reality for these military aid packages.
This is perhaps the most critical insight for the listener to really grasp. When major nations authorize these large-scale military aid packages, the source makes a financially striking assertion. Most of that aid money never actually leaves the donor country's economy. It is not wired as cash to the recipient country.
So what happens if Congress authorizes, say, $10 billion? Where does that money land?
It's immediately routed straight to domestic defense contractors, your Lockheed Martins, Raytheons, Boeings, or their European equivalents. And this money serves two primary purposes at the same time. First, it funds the replacement of the older existing inventory, the weapons systems being pulled from the donor country's stockpiles and shipped overseas. Second, and this is often more substantial, it funds entirely new production lines and orders for next-generation equipment.
Okay, so just to be clear, if the U.S. sends 1,000 older Javelin missiles to the conflict zone, the appropriated aid money isn't paying for the Javelins themselves, which are already owned by the U.S. military.
That's right. They're already on the books.
The money pays the manufacturer to build 1,000 brand new, upgraded Javelins for the U.S. Army stockpile, guaranteeing years of backlog for that contractor.
Precisely. The funds become an internal economic transaction, a massive government-backed purchase order that simultaneously achieves a foreign policy goal. So the analysis suggests that when a politician says, we're sending aid to a foreign ally, what's actually happening economically is we're placing a multi-billion-dollar order with our domestic defense industry.
It is, quite literally, stimulus spending, but with munitions. The duality of this system is fascinating. This mechanism ensures that the money cycles right back into the domestic economy of the donor nation.
And that secures high-paying manufacturing jobs, it stabilizes key industrial bases, and crucially, it removes virtually all financial risk for the defense companies involved. They're operating in a guaranteed market environment backed by state funding, with demand perpetually justified by the needs of the proxy war.
And because the funds are categorized as aid for an unambiguous moral cause, this domestic stimulus spending bypasses the usual political resistance that might greet, large-scale direct industrial subsidies.
Absolutely. The public supports the aid effort. The defense industry receives the guaranteed revenue and investment. It's a politically astute way to inject massive government capital into the private defense sector without a public outcry about corporate welfare. The moral urgency shields the financial mechanism.
Let's move to the physical reality of the hardware rotation, what the sources call the weapons clearance sale. This mechanism ties directly back to what we were just talking about, showing how that aid money enables a critical military housekeeping function.
Continuous arsenal modernization. Right. Inventory management is a massive, complex, and very expensive endeavor for any modern military. They maintain these vast stockpiles of older equipment tanks, armored personnel carriers, artillery, some of which might be nearing its mandated service life, or it's just been superseded by much newer, more technologically advanced systems. This older inventory still requires expensive maintenance, climate-controlled storage, complex logistical oversight, and eventually very costly decommissioning.
So by shipping this old weapons inventory to the conflict zone, the military achieves a simultaneous clearance. It satisfies the immediate high-volume needs of the battlefield needs that might otherwise require sending brand new expensive equipment. And at the same time, it clears the balance sheets of the donor country. They're getting rid of their aging, expensive-to-maintain stock.
And as we just established, that clearance is immediately followed by the profitable replacement cycle. As the older inventory is shipped out and consumed in the fighting, brand new, latest generation weapon systems are immediately ordered and built to replace them, often justified under the banner of maintaining national readiness. This cycle guarantees the defense industry always maintains a robust backlog of state-funded orders for their most profitable, cutting-edge equipment.
And this modernization is all happening at Ukrainian expense. But beyond just simple inventory rotation, the conflict provides the invaluable benefit of real-time innovation and destruction feedback. This is the R&D component of the business model.
The sources highlight the critical value of real-time destruction feedback. Just think of the engineering and strategic insights gained from this. A military can spend years and billions of dollars testing a new electronic warfare system in a controlled, peacetime environment, but those tests always rely on simulated enemy conditions.
But in this conflict, that system is deployed against a sophisticated active opponent. They receive data on component failure when it's subjected to high-intensity enemy jamming. They learn which anti-tank missile guidance systems are susceptible to which countermeasures. They get instant high-fidelity feedback on the resilience of armor plating under various angles of attack. This is data that is it's simply unattainable during peacetime.
This capability to iterate and refine complex systems from drone defenses to logistical software far faster than peacetime R&D allows is, well, it's priceless. And what's fascinating here is that this cycle inherently ensures military systems remain cutting edge, and critically, it justifies the immense expenditure.
How so?
The information gained from the destruction of weapon system Alpha today directly informs the design and, crucially, justifies the increased complexity and cost of weapon system Alpha 2.0 tomorrow. This maintains a profitable, continuous innovation curve for the entire defense technology sector.
That structural self-justification brings us neatly to our next segment, concerning institutional survival and the powerful rebrand experienced by NATO. If we cast our minds back to the immediate pre-conflict period, NATO was facing some pretty significant existential questions, from within and without.
The narrative was definitely stagnating. The conversations were centered on things like, why does NATO still exist? Who is the defining enemy now that the Soviet Union is gone? Is this expensive, large-scale security framework still relevant in a world of cyber threats and asymmetric conflict? Internal consensus was fraying, and budget commitments were being questioned across member states.
The sources argue that the conflict provided the only answer necessary to revitalize the entire institution. The resurgence of a familiar, large-scale, state-level antagonist instantly restored purpose, clarity, and relevance to the massive security architecture that was originally built during the Cold War.
Suddenly, all those complex existential questions just disappeared. They were replaced by the urgent, unambiguous mandate of collective defense against a recognized threat.
As the analysis notes, crisis is the best rebrand.
It absolutely is, and the results are tangible and immediate. Budgets surged across virtually all member nations. Many finally committed to hitting or exceeding that long-promised 2% of GDP defense spending target, a goal that had been languishing for years.
Membership expanded,
signaling a massive geopolitical realignment and increasing the scope of the alliance. Relevance was instantly restored, transforming NATO from a questioned bureaucracy back into an indispensable, active coordinator of Western defense strategy.
So if we connect this to the bigger picture, the proxy war provided the necessary external threat, the validation to inflate, unify, and secure this vast security apparatus that existed before 2022. It justified every committee, every spending line, every strategic position that might have otherwise been questioned in an era of perceived peace.
It solved NATO's strategic business development challenge overnight.
By providing a clear existential enemy.
It's the institutional equivalent of a company that was struggling to justify its product and then suddenly sees a catastrophic new market demand materialize, making their existing infrastructure and expertise instantly necessary and highly valued again.
This next segment is critical because it addresses the necessary public relations and media framing that supports this entire economic structure. The morality shield.
Yeah.
The war, according to the analysis, comes pre-packaged with morality. It's simplified to a point of radical clarity.
Yes, the narrative requires this radical simplification to function effectively for external stakeholders. One side is presented as pure, the unprovoked victim fighting for universal values. The opposing side is cast as evil, the unambiguous aggressor. And within this binary framework, the analysis suggests complexity is deemed treason.
Meaning that acknowledging nuance or historical context or multi-sided interests, all the things a true deep dive would normally require, are suppressed because they threaten that required moral clarity. Why is this black and white narrative perfect for external functions? The sources list several reasons. It's perfect for driving headlines and attention retention, which is essential in a fragmented media environment. It's perfect for global fundraising efforts. But most crucially, it is perfect for silencing dissent and preventing necessary political review.
When a conflict is framed as an unambiguous moral crusade, raising specific analytical questions about its duration, its cost, or its secondary consequences becomes politically perilous. The moral consensus acts as a powerful deterrent against oversight. The sources detail the exact questions that become politically taboo or are labeled as dangerous if they're raised by elected officials or media figures.
Can you give us some specific examples of those taboo questions as defined by the sources?
Sure, they include fundamental questions like, what are the concrete, achievable end goals of this conflict, and how are we measuring them? Is the current strategy actually achieving those goals, or is it simply accelerating destruction? What are the documented corruption issues within the aid and logistics mechanisms, and how are they being systematically mitigated? And critically, what are the long-term unintended consequences for global stability that this indefinite commitment might entail?
Because if you ask, what does victory actually look like in concrete budgetary terms? Or how are we tracking the billions in funds to prevent misuse? You're not heard as being fiscally responsible.
No, you're immediately framed as undermining the righteous cause and thereby aiding the enemy.
So this raises an important question for you, the listener, to consider. How does this intense moral framing influence decision-making and public tolerance for indefinite conflict? The simplification is incredibly efficient for generating immediate consensus and rapid resource deployment, which is great for the business model.
However, by stifling that necessary critical review and strategic debate about duration or exit ramps, it structurally guides the conflict towards continuation rather than a measured, responsible conclusion. Moral certainty in this context becomes a barrier to necessary strategic debate.
Let's look now at the escalation loop, which details the mechanics of that continuation. The analysis observes how each new weapon system introduced into the conflict is framed in public discourse. It's consistently presented as the game changer, the one system that is just enough to change the balance.
Yet, the sources quickly counter this narrative by asserting that the balance never changes. The introduction of long-range missiles or advanced armor or specialized fighter jets, while they might be momentarily impactful, they don't typically lead to resolution or definitive victory. Instead, the enemy adapts. They deploy countermeasures, or they simply accelerate their own production to compensate.
Which ensures the cycle remains intact. The outcome of introducing a new system isn't resolution, it's an accelerated process of destruction on both sides.
More weapons lead to more destruction.
Which then inevitably leads to more urgent justification for the next, more expensive round of funding, requiring an even newer system to change the still unchanged balance. It's a beautifully consistent yet deeply tragic feedback loop built for velocity.
And this loop is sustained by the structural value of those undefined goals we talked about. The analysis argues that the external powers resist defining what victory or peace absolutely requires because, structurally, undefined goals are easier to fund indefinitely. If you mandate a specific measurable metric, you create a political risk. the risk of having to declare success or failure, and crucially, having to stop the appropriations.
The lack of clear metrics for success means the system is built for continuation, not conclusion. This removes the political pressure for resolution on external decision-makers. The goal subtly shifts from winning the war to sustaining the effort and maintaining readiness.
In this model, success is often measured not by outcomes on the ground, but by the continuous increasing size of the security appropriations bill past each fiscal cycle.
It's the ultimate perpetual motion machine of government expenditure. The primary metric of success is the amount of funding secured, not the resolution of the initial problem. The conflict becomes self-justifying through its own consumption rate.
This efficiency leads us to the crucial question in the next segment: accounting for beneficiaries. Who, specifically, profits from this highly optimized business model? And it's essential to start by defining who the sources explicitly exclude from that beneficiary list.
Right. The analysis is very clear on this. The financial gains do not accrue to Ukrainian civilians facing destruction and displacement, nor to the conscripts fighting and dying, nor to the millions who suffer economic destabilization globally.
Nor to the future generations who will inherit the massive debt and the environmental wreckage.
So who is on the balance sheet for benefits? The source material details the specific industries that profit directly. The first group is the obvious one, the major defense contractors who are selling and replacing weapons at high margins, backed by risk-free government guarantees.
Then you have the arms manufacturers, a slight distinction, who are focused on building the replacements, fabricating the next-gen systems, and maintaining the production lines funded by that stimulus spending we discussed earlier. Their stock prices and guaranteed backlogs reflect the immense stability brought by this sustained demand.
And we also have to include security consultants and specialized advisory firms. These highly compensated firms play a vital role, advising on strategy, logistics, training, and, crucially, helping governments manage and justify the spending of those immense aid packages. They're the highly compensated middlemen.
But the most cynical yet economically compelling observation in the analysis is the concept of the double payment model. This principle states that war, under this perfected model, pays twice.
Once to destroy, and then again to rebuild. Let's break that down. The destruction phase funnels massive amounts of cash to the defense industries, logistics firms, security providers. The longer the war goes on, the greater the destruction and the greater those initial profits.
But once the fighting slows down, or when a frozen conflict scenario stabilizes, the immense multi-decade reconstruction phase begins. This involves vast infrastructure projects, demining operations, rebuilding entire cities, and establishing security for all these projects. This funnels massive amounts of cash to reconstruction firms. And this is where the true long-term, stable revenue stream begins, often funded by grants and loans from the same external powers that funded the destruction.
And here's the punchline, according to the sources. It's often the same corporate entities or their affiliated subsidiaries, receiving both the destruction contracts and the subsequent rebuilding contracts.
Right. A company that provided logistics support during the war is perfectly positioned to win the logistics contract for the rebuilding phase. A firm specializing in defense electronics might have a subsidiary specializing in smart infrastructure development.
This establishes a full circular economy of conflict. It guarantees continuous revenue streams, not just during the volatility of the fighting, but for decades into the recovery and reconstruction. It guarantees a long-term, cradle-to-grave financial pipeline derived directly from the conflict.
Which makes the entire proposition highly attractive to capital. The incentives are perfectly aligned. Profit from the demand created by mass destruction, and then profit again from the necessity of rebuilding what was just destroyed.
That structural financial certainty dictates the environment around resolution, which leads us directly to the next segment, the taboo of peace. When a business model is this profitable and this stable, when the incentives are built for continuation, anything that threatens its continuity is treated as a major disruptive risk.
The sources state that within this financialized system, peace talks are treated like betrayal. The discussion of off-ramps or negotiated settlements immediately shifts from a strategic consideration to a moral one. Negotiation becomes labeled as weakness, and even proposing a ceasefire is framed as surrender to the evil antagonist.
This moral language creates an almost impenetrable political and media barrier to any rational discussion about resolution. It makes it nearly impossible for a political leader to seriously pursue peace talks without risking being branded as an appeaser or a traitor to the cause.
And why does peace pose such a fundamental threat to this established profit system? Because peace demands accountability. It would immediately raise all the uncomfortable questions that the current highly simplified narrative successfully suppresses.
If the war suddenly stops, the political pressure for transparency becomes immense. People will start asking, why did this conflict last so long if definitive victory was never achieved? The implication being that it might have lasted longer than was strictly necessary. They would ask, who truly profited? Which would lead to uncomfortable audits of those double payment contracts, the logistics spending, the efficiency of the aid mechanism.
And most damagingly, if the strategic goals were subjective and undefined, a sudden cessation would force the question, what was the real objective, if not immediate definitive victory? If the objective was duration, then the sustainability of the entire security commitment comes into question.
So peace is economically disruptive.
It's economically disruptive. It cuts off the revenue streams for the defense contractors, it ends the geopolitical stress test, and it removes the primary justification for the inflated security budgets. It forces a complete financial and political reassessment, which is structurally damaging to the established financial interests.
The conclusion, therefore, based on this economic analysis, is chilling. The war continues not because definitive victory is perpetually just around the corner, but because peace is economically untenable for the powerful external stakeholders.
That financial certainty sets up the likely future outcome presented in the analysis in our final segment. It's not outright collapse for either side, nor is it a swift, total victory. The sources predict a transition to a frozen conflict.
And a frozen conflict, in this context, is the commercially optimal solution. It transitions the war dynamic from a volatile, high-risk, high-expenditure conflict into a predictable, stable, long-term operational expense.
We have to define that financial transition clearly. The initial high-intensity phase of the war required immense capex, or capital expenditure, massive, volatile spending on large hardware orders, infrastructure investment, and rapid mobilization. This is high risk, high reward, and ultimately unstable.
You can think of CapEx like a company buying and building a massive server farm, a huge multi-billion-dollar one-time upfront cost. Once the fighting transitions into a frozen conflict, the model shifts to OpEx, or operational expenditure.
And OpEx is the guaranteed, predictable monthly service fee. A frozen conflict is characterized by contained, low-level fighting, permanent militarization along a defined border, and ongoing but predictable funding requirements for maintenance, surveillance, small-scale resupply, and replacement of attrition losses. It is a war that never ends, but never quite ends.
And why is this permanent, low-level state deemed perfect by the economic interests we've been discussing?
Because it guarantees continued, ongoing, predictable funding without the high financial costs and instability of a full-scale disruptive confrontation. It provides continuous low-level R&D through limited skirmishes. It maintains institutional relevance for organizations like NATO. And, critically, it avoids the sudden cessation of revenue that peace would bring. It's the ultimate stable financial outcome for the business of conflict.
It guarantees a perpetual motion machine of government funding based on the stable maintenance of an external threat. The defense industry is no longer just selling one-off hardware. They're now selling an annual subscription to existential security.
That's a perfect way to summarize it.
Which brings us to our synthesis. This entire deep dive has been focused on analyzing a conflict presented to the public as a necessary moral crusade for survival and freedom. But what we found, underneath all the flags and slogans, is a highly optimized, sophisticated system designed for continuation, where profitability is entirely dependent on duration, not on resolution. When war becomes structurally sustainable, peace becomes economically disruptive, and disruption is unequivocally bad for business.
And the sources compel us to reflect on the true, localized cost of this model. Proxy wars save powerful nations from fighting directly, shielding their populace and their economies from the brunt of conflict, which is a significant strategic gain. But in doing so, they fundamentally guarantee someone else always will pay the full, localized price of the geopolitical strategy, the human, the infrastructural, and the environmental tragedy. So maybe you can ponder the true cost of outsourced geopolitical strategy and what it really means when global stability comes through perpetual, localized conflict.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please like, subscribe, and share this video.
Also, let us know in the comments what really stood out to you in this conversation, and if there's any related topic or a new topic that you would like us to cover in a future video.